The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Jolene Schaefer and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for SWK Technologies. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Your Microsoft 365 Environment is Under Attack, presented by James Slaby of Acronis. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute to keep the background noise down. However, you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. To submit a question, look for the questions section in your GoToWebinar. We will answer all questions towards the end of the presentation. We are recording this presentation and will be distributed tomorrow to all attendees as well as to those who registered but were not able to attend. Please take a moment after the presentation to answer our one survey question. With that said, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend our webinar. We're here to help you get the most out of your software solutions and help you find an easier way to run your business by providing you software and industry knowledge, tools, and support whenever you need it. We've invited Acronis here today because they are the industry experts on cybersecurity. So whether you're here doing research for a new solution or you're just here to learn, we'd like to encourage you to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Lastly, as a quick reminder, SWK is constantly sharing important updates and software tips and tricks on our social media channels. So we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to James.
Thank you for that, Jolene. Let's see, let me share my screen for the audience here.
And we're seeing it, James.
Is it the right one?
Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everybody to this SWK event. I really appreciate them hosting us here today. The title of the event is Your Microsoft 365 Environment is Under Attack! Exclamation point. Now, of course, we all know that pretty much everybody's environment is under attack, but because Microsoft 365 has become so popular as the kind of way that many businesses run their business, at least from a productivity application standpoint, it's a really juicy target for cyber criminals. You know, they're why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. Why do cyber criminals go after Microsoft 365? Because it's everywhere. All right. If you're not familiar with Acronis, we've been around for 18 years, but fairly recently have grown to the point and gotten the kind of investments from some venture firms that we now have a valuation north of $2.5 billion. So we're that rare 18-year-old unicorn in tech. We've got dual headquarters, main ones in Switzerland, international one in Singapore. We are doing business all over the world. We have many thousands of business customers and a huge network of partners. All our technology goes to market through partners like SWK. We don't sell directly to anybody. And increasingly, that is delivered to customers through in the form of managed services from managed service providers. Anyway, so if you're not familiar with us, we've been around for a long time, historically known as a backup company, but about 4 years ago, we started edging into the cybersecurity business as well as backup, and that's kind of our new claim to fame these days, is equipping MSPs with the tools they need to offer a suite of cybersecurity, backup, and disaster recovery services under the collective concept of cyber protection. So our one product is Acronis Cyber Cloud. This is our backup, DR, and all the cybersecurity services we offer all kind of rolled into one. Our partners love it because they basically have one license to deal with, one console. There's only a single agent that goes on remote servers and desktops and other endpoints, and one vendor's neck to choke, so to speak, for issues. But the efficiencies and from both an operations and a cost standpoint have made this approach really popular. I'll talk about some other advantages of kind of being all things backup and cybersecurity at once a little bit later. So I can brag about it, but it really is a lot more credible when third-party testing organizations and tech research firms like I used to work for provide a blessing of our technology, and our cybersecurity capabilities have really performed spectacularly in these independent tests and certifications, particularly our anti-ransomware capability, which if you're following the news, you know that that's kind of a big deal. All right, this is kind of thing that's my main job at Acronis, is to come to audiences like yourselves and talk about cybercrime trends, because they are endlessly fascinating. And if you're running IT or security operations for a small or medium business or an MSP, this has probably got the center of your attention many hours of the week. So as I imagine you're all familiar with, every part of your IT infrastructure is under attack. You've got growing data volumes. You've got a bunch of folks who, in the wake of the pandemic, started working from home. So there's a lot more data out there, not in the safe confines of an office building with a network firewall and IT support person on hand, all of those things. And the business impact of the kind of threats that this opens up is really going up. Antivirus attacks are going up, and traditional signature-based AV is missing them. For the average organization, attack costs are getting to the point where they're almost untenable to manage on their own. Meanwhile, cyber attacks themselves are really growing in frequency and complexity. Cybercrime has really evolved into kind of an industrial scale business. It's one of the biggest industries in the world these days. Figure I often quote is from Cybersecurity Ventures that the cost of cybercrime to business is going to reach $6 trillion globally this year. It's extremely lucrative. They've really industrialized their methods, gotten much more efficient at production and distribution. They're comparable to like a Salesforce.com in delivering malware as a service and enlisting an army of distributors whose sole job is to get their product, that malware, onto your machine, and then get cut into the revenues for any deals that they close. Example, ransoms collected from a successful ransomware attack. So it really looks a lot like the legitimate SaaS industry, just evil, right? And we see the results of this in things like the Solarwinds attack. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The giant ransomware attack that we just saw this week on the world's largest meat processing concern, right? They do most of the beef, a lot of the pork, a lot of the poultry, particularly in the US, but they're everywhere now. It's a global conglomerate, and they got taken down by a ransomware attack. A lot of their processing plants in the US and Australia went offline. Right, you're probably familiar with the Colonial Pipeline attack, another big ransomware attack, this time on critical infrastructure. And that caused all kinds of havoc with gas shortages, panic buying and hoarding. I was talking to some partners just a day or two ago who were in South Carolina, and many of their gas stations are still out of gas. So bad guys are getting just really better and more efficient at it, more targeted in their attacks. And so you can expect to continue to see news of a ransomware attack, something large scale and affecting many people besides the business that they're targeting pretty much every week for the foreseeable future. If I can put my marketing hat on for a minute, that's actually helpful. You don't have to spend a lot of time educating prospects about, or your management about, what ransomware is, because they're reading about it in the New York Times and seeing it on their cable news network. It's not just something that tech people are aware of anymore. Of course, we were all moving our applications to the cloud. When I joined Acronis, a lot of our software was sold as perpetual licenses with annual maintenance fees that businesses would install on their own premises in their server closet or data center, depending on their size. And in the 7 years since that, we've shifted massively into delivering that as a service. So it's backup as a service, it's DR as a service, it's anti-malware as a service. And of course, there are actually bundles of these services so that you can, as a small business, you can effectively outsource a lot of your IT and security operations concerns to a technology provider who handles it on your behalf. In that same way, every other application is moving towards the SaaS model. So obviously a lot of advantages for business, lower capital equipment costs and depreciation. It's more elastic. It's easier to kind of add and shrink capacity as you need it and not pay for it if it's sitting idle. Just the way the world is going. And if you weren't going that way, you probably got pushed that way in a big way once the pandemic hit and suddenly all your users were at home, and it was much more challenging to staff a data center. So we're not all in centralized premises anymore, even though the pandemic's ending. A lot of us are going to continue to work at least a few days from home. So cloud services make a lot of sense in that regard. But in our rush to get there, many of us didn't do such a great job of securing the data that's stored in the cloud. And, you know, if those of us who are developing new cloud applications didn't always do our best to seal up public interfaces, leaving a lot of data unprotected, hanging out there, probably unencrypted, hence some of the headlines that we saw about massive breaches that were basically due to human error based on unfamiliarity with building and managing as a service type applications. I mentioned remote work. This is, again, going to continue to be an issue for many businesses and the managed service providers who take care of them. And, you know, for instance, I've been working from my dining room table where I'm sitting now for 15 months, but Cronus is just starting to invite me back into the office a couple days a week. But I can expect to continue that work from home. Most of our workforce is going to be like that as well. That has caused some cybersecurity issues. For instance, I'm a security geek, so when I installed a consumer grade Wi-Fi router cable modem, I knew to change the default admin password, but I suspect most people don't do that, and they've been sitting there with an open default password to manage their network for some period of years. As I mentioned, I'm often working on a personal device. You know, I shift off from my work computer and go into another room of the house and work on a personal computer or a tablet. All these things are significantly less robust from a cybersecurity perspective than when we're working in the office and surrounded by firewalls and being constantly patched with the latest revs of operating systems and applications. So this is going to continue to be an issue that MSPs and businesses are going to have to wrestle with, the kind of relative vulnerability of remote work versus centralized environments. Another big story that really raised its head, you know, I've been following these kind of events for several years, but I think it really bubbled up into the public consciousness, the concept of a tech supply chain attack back in December when the news of the Solarwinds breach got out. These are very sophisticated attacks, almost always mounted by hostile state actors, you know, the NSA or its equivalent in Russia or China or Iran or North Korea. Then they're either doing it for geopolitical advantage or to make money. But they're rather more sophisticated than the typical cybercriminal attack. And part of it is that your NSA and its equivalents have unlimited patience, huge budgets, and access to really top-notch cybersecurity talent. So if they target you, chances are they're going to get you. The Solarwinds breach is just a typical example of how these advanced persistent threat attacks work. They managed to worm their way into Solarwinds, a tech vendor. They make tools, IT operations tools for businesses and government, very popular, very big market share, kind of successful tech software supplier that way. And the bad guys, suspected to be Russia in this case, managed to worm their way into the software repository for SolarWinds' very popular network management tool. Once they compromised that, all of SolarWinds customers downloaded that malware when they did the next feature or security patch update. So getting into your targets by an intermediary that's in their tech supply chain, pretty scary. And they managed to hit hundreds of targets where they stole all kinds of information, both government secrets and sensitive commercial data. We see this again and again. Microsoft just suffered one a couple months ago, the so-called Half-Diem breach that targeted Microsoft Exchange servers. Now, if you've moved to Microsoft 365, you're not managing Exchange servers on your premise, but there's still a lot of those out there. And that was another very serious, Chinese are believed to be behind that one. And they managed to steal a lot of sensitive data that way. So this is a very tough one for businesses and MSPs to have to deal with because of the sophistication and the long time frame that these adversaries are willing to put into targeting, building, and prosecuting these attacks. Ransomware is, of course, the one that gets all the headlines these days for good reason. I mentioned the industrial scale of it, which means the frequency is going up. I think ransomware attacks increased by nearly 200% over the last year and something like 80% worldwide. It's just the most pervasive, destructive, costly threat to deal with out there, and that's because it's so profitable for cybercriminals. They're really making money off it, and very few of them ever get held to task for it. You know, there's very few prosecutions. They're generally operating in countries that are beyond the extradition reach of their target victims, and they're getting more devious all the time. So it used to be they'd lock up your data, say, pay us in Bitcoin for the decryption key or you'll never see your data again. And in many cases, if you weren't well prepared with good recent backups, it was extremely difficult for you to try to recover without that decryption key. They've got new tactics now to make you pay up more quickly and not try to recover on your own somehow. And that includes things like stealing a bunch of data first and then saying, look, then they trigger the encryption attack and say, look, you can get your decryption key back, you can unencrypt your data, but if you don't pay us, we're going to leak your data online. And that can cause problems. You know, it could be sensitive intellectual property that your competitors get access to. If you're subject to privacy compliance regimes, you may be fined for letting sensitive customer data and not protecting it adequately. Certainly, if you're a public company, it can really badly affect your stock price. We saw that big aluminum company, Norsk Hydro in Norway, take a giant hit on their stock when news got out of a big ransomware attack on their aluminum processing facilities. It can also damage your brand in general and the trust that your customers place in you. It's like, why would I want to partner with this person that can't secure their own network? And finally, of course, just the containment and remediation costs of a ransomware attack can be really expensive. It's also an existential threat to a lot of companies. If you've been brought down for a matter of weeks by a ransomware attack where your critical systems go offline, there's a good chance you'll be out of business, statistically speaking, in 6 months or so. So between the growing frequency and sophistication, you know, ransomware malware typically looks for countermeasures and disables them, looks for backups and encrypts them. It's really probably the biggest scourge of the industry, and something that Microsoft 365 users in particular need to be worried about. Just a few examples. I just updated this slide yesterday. Seems like I'm updating it every other day here with another giant attack. But JBS Foods is the sort of big one. It's too recent to have a sense of how expensive it's going to be for them, but it definitely made giant headlines because people were suddenly thinking, am I going to be able to get hamburgers for my cookout this weekend? Colonial Pipeline is one that we have a much greater sense of the extent of the damage. In addition to paying a ransom of nearly $5 million, it also caused widespread outages. The interesting thing was that the operations tech of Colonial wasn't affected. They didn't lose the ability to deliver the oil and gas that their pipeline transports. The real issue was their billing system got attacked by ransomware. So rather than ship oil and gas to people that they couldn't collect money on later, they shut it down until they got their billing system back online. But we're still living with the kind of echoes of that attack and its disruptions to a kind of bit of critical infrastructure, a key element of our everyday supply chain. I won't go through all the examples here, but it's useful to note that ransomware attackers are equal opportunity. They'll hit every industry. Even when the ransoms aren't that big, an example I used to have on here of one of the University of California medical schools, which paid $1 million ransom because the data that got locked up was some very valuable cutting edge medical research that their professors and associates were working on. But it's increasingly common now to see ransoms in the tens of millions of dollars. I think the average ransom last year ran up to $300,000, and it's getting harder to avoid paying them. So particularly if you can imagine your Microsoft 365 environment going down or one of your customers' environments going down, that's a very serious problem. It's going to be very difficult to operate the business without many of those sort of basic productivity functions that 365 delivers to its users. So there is no panacea here, but you know, at Acronis we have some very specific ideas about how you need to take care of it. And I won't go through every one of these, but a lot of it is around trying to bring some integration and automation to what you're doing. If you're kind of dealing with threats manually and in real time, you're never going to keep up with them with the way that they are churning them out. And by the way, most ransomware threats are zero-day threats, meaning nobody has seen that particular iteration of the malware before, so it's not going to get caught by a signature matching antivirus solution. So you of course want to do things like sew up your access to sensitive systems where you can. Multi-factor authentication is a really obvious one there. You know, think about disaster recovery as a fallback. You know, disaster recovery as a service these days has actually kind of democratized DR. You know, disaster recovery used to be something that you only implemented if you were a large enterprise and you could afford to build a standby data center and staff it with people and put dedicated network connections to it. It's all very complicated and expensive, and it only made sense if you were like a big financial institution with millions of dollars pouring on the floor every hour. If you suffered a big outage because of a tornado or your data center burning down or cybersecurity attack. Nowadays, you can get DR where when you need to recover from a disaster, when your main site gets targeted, you can flip a switch and spin up replicas of all your key applications in the cloud. And that makes it affordable to kind of small and medium businesses and mid-market companies that could never consider putting a disaster recovery solution in the old days. All right. So let's move on. I wanted to talk, I hope I've given you a sense of the urgency and the threat and the difficulty in defending against this kind of array of cyber threats that are out there, particularly for Microsoft 365, which is among the juiciest and most popular targets for cyber criminals. So for starters, improving the backup of your Microsoft 365 data is critical. Microsoft does a very good job at protecting the parts of Microsoft 365 infrastructure that it's responsible for, and it will provide you with some short-term data recovery. If you look at your M365 contract, you'll find it's pretty limited, especially if you're used to backing up data yourself. Compared to traditional premise-based backup solutions, Microsoft is doing a fairly minimal job, but it's all in the contract. So it's not like they're shirking responsibilities here, but they're drawing a very clear line. Look, we'll be able to restore your data going back X number of days based on your license agreement, or rather your service contract with us. But beyond that, you're on your own. And there's a fair number of other features of more robust backup solutions that are really useful to have, particularly in this environment where people are accumulating tons of data, emails, data stored in online SharePoint repositories, etc. But there are still plenty of ways that you can lose data in this environment. Forrester Research, my old employer, I used to be an analyst covering security and networking stuff back in the day, has identified a handful of these, like accidental deletion is a big one. And that's one that I'm guilty of myself, deleting emails that I think are run their course of usefulness to me, and then I find a month later I need them again. I suppose that's not accidental, but this is pretty much the idea here. Departing employees often take information with them that they shouldn't, and as I've been saying throughout this, cyber attacks are a really serious issue. Insider threat has been raising its head again. This is not just a guy with an axe to grind who leaves the company and plants a logic bomb to detonate when a month after he leaves, but often it's just unintentional mistakes. Your IT operations guy fluffs the backup or muffs the application upgrade, and data gets lost that way. So between many different ways that you can lose data and how it can adversely affect your business, again, you may be expected under the scrutiny of some regulatory agency to protect customer data for a certain period of months or years, or be in violation of compliance there and be subject to fines and other sanctions. We all know that downtime and lost data makes it hard for people to do their jobs effectively, and that costs money. So for a lot of reasons, you want to get a little bit more sophisticated with your backup than the baseline of protection that Microsoft is giving you. Our particular solution for this, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on what Acronis does, you can always reach out to us for more details if you're interested in hearing what we do. But a couple of things that I think are super cool and I think businesses find extremely valuable is the ability to search your backups and restore selective bits of it. So if your CEO loses an email, you can find that email and forward it to him instantly. This is super handy. You're not having to restore a whole server or a whole data store to get at things like this. And of course, the way we do it for Microsoft environments doesn't require an agent on the endpoint. We also back up directly with Microsoft 365's own data center, and there's real advantages to this in terms of performance and the amount of work that the service provider or business customer has to do to get it. We also back up a very broad range of Microsoft 365 associated resources, including online Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, and even provide some extra protection for Teams. There's a promo we have going on. I'll just mention it in passing that if you sign up with us, we'll give you free cloud storage for your mailboxes through, I think, October, I think it runs. Some other things that are really useful and cool that we auto-detect when you add new Microsoft 365 users and automatically add them to the backup plan. I won't go through this list of features, but I mentioned search before. That's an incredibly popular feature that you won't get with just a kind of a default Microsoft backup. The security features are the other sort of really important thing I think that we're doing here. Signature-based and behavioral anti-malware that's based with our machine intelligence capability, so it can detect and stop zero-day attacks, which 90% of ransomware attacks are 0 days these days. Really automating security capabilities so that you're not doing a lot of manual work. Will actually automatically detect changes to your environment and do things like scan your backups for malware, so that if you have to do a restoral from backup, you don't have to worry about the backup having been infected and have to go through the process all over again. We also collect forensics in our backup archives, so that if you do suffer an incident, we can actually get data out of it that will help you identify the source of the breach and take steps to remediate it so it doesn't happen again in the future. I think I've been through most of these. It's probably useful to just touch on some of the other features that we're bringing to the table. Again, this integrated suite of backup and cybersecurity services for 365 that includes URL filtering, to prevent users from visiting websites that we know to be fake. Our cybersecurity research operations centers around the world are keeping track of all the fake websites. COVID information was a popular way to get people to click on links and download files containing malicious malware-bearing PDF documents and things like that, because they wanted information about COVID. But we're also doing the anti-ransomware piece is probably the most significant one, given how major that attack is. All right. Said I wasn't going to talk a lot about Acronis features, but here I am. This is the last kind of major thing I want to highlight here, which is this notion that there's some unique advantages that come to integrating backup and security both on the endpoint and on the back end. So for instance, our backups are very tightly secured, which means that, like for instance, ransomware that tries to spin around your network, find backup archives and encrypt them so that you can't recover from them and not have to pay. We very tightly protect those. And the fact that we are doing things like scanning backups for security vulnerabilities and the presence of malware means that that processing burden is removed from the endpoints. We're doing it all in the cloud. So that's a really efficient way to do that. It's also a lot faster. Backup talking to security means things like our machine intelligence enabled anti-ransomware capability will detect and stop a ransomware attack. But sometimes it takes a minute for us to identify that there's a ransomware attack going on, and a few files might get encrypted. Backup capability is caching files locally so that you can instantly restore those few files that were encrypted before our machine intelligence capability woke up and stopped the attack. And it's done completely transparently to the end user. The management console will get an alert saying, oh, look, we stopped and killed and recovered from a ransomware attack on this user's workstation. The user never knows. It's like the attack never happened from their perspective. It also means things like the ability to restore only clean backups, right? Where you can actually do vulnerability scanning and patch your backup archives before you restore them. That's pretty cool stuff, and we're the only ones really doing it. All right. With that, I would like to hand off back to Jolene for Q&A. Jolene, do you want to keep this slide up for now?
Yeah, that
why
works
don't
great.
we do that?
Thanks, James. We'll now open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please enter them into the question section of your GoToWebinar. And just a reminder, everyone, we do have a subject matter expert here. This is a great opportunity to have your questions answered in real time. And we did have a few questions come in during the presentation, James. The first being, what can my business do about supply chain attacks like the Solarwinds breach?
Starting off with a tough one. I think I touched on this a little earlier, which means that if someone from Kim Jong-un's very impressive cyber criminal wing of his intelligence agency decides to target you, chances are they're going to get into your systems, right? North Korea is under all these very tough economic sanctions. They can't trade with most of the world. And so Kim is pretty much funding his regime with ransomware these days. So they are highly motivated to prosecute their attacks successfully. You look at things like the Solarwinds breach, which was lurking in people's systems for over a year before one cybersecurity vendor sort of accidentally stumbled on traces of it that led them to follow the trail and eventually uncover it. And so they're managing to breach the defenses of some of the most sophisticated government and commercial organizations in the world with this stuff. Suggest that what that means is you need to be very scrupulous about backup. You probably want to start thinking about implementing some threat detectors like data loss prevention technology. Increasingly, this is integrated into other things. We've got it coming in a very shortly upcoming release, which monitors your network for suspicious traffic patterns. It's like, why is this process uploading tons of data to this weird website on the other side of the world at 3 o'clock in the morning? That looks odd. So those sort of kind of instrumenting your network with those capabilities will help. But at the end of the day, it's a really scary challenge. I think the other thing that you can do that is probably useful, and I bring this up because I wrote an ebook about it that I'm going to point you to at the end. That is something you can download for free. We won't even ask you for your email address to get it. Is vetting your technology providers to make sure they're doing everything they can to prevent themselves from becoming a link in a supply chain attack to you. I actually put together a little mini framework to kind of prioritize the sort of key issues that your tech providers ought to be worrying about. So if they can't, say if you're shopping for a managed service provider, you say, oh, I'm ready to outsource my backup and cybersecurity to a provider so I can focus on my business and pay someone who's a better expert at it to do it than me. You get some confidence that you ask the same questions to all your prospective providers there, and the ones that come up with the best answers are probably going to deliver the least risk of harming you by accidentally being unintentionally being a conduit for malware from state actors that target them first as their kind of avenue into your business. So that's not a particularly satisfying answer, I imagine, to the questioner, but that's the world that we live in now. You know, it used to be that nation states only kind of targeted each other for surveillance, espionage, trying to steal intellectual property, state secrets, and now they're going after businesses because they can. That's a huge way to gain or geopolitical advantage. Maybe catch up in a technology race. It's easier to steal it than develop it yourself, and disrupt rival countries' infrastructure. We're increasingly seeing attacks on critical infrastructure that way. So that's kind of a frightening prospect, but there are some modest steps you can do to protect yourself. Whatever happens, don't ever point at someone and laugh at their misery if they're victimized by one of these attacks, because we're all targets. Hope that helps.
Perfect. And we have another. What other cybersecurity tools should we be deploying to protect Microsoft 365?
Right, so I alluded to one initially, I think data loss prevention, which like a lot of cybersecurity technology categories, used to be a standalone product, increasingly is being integrated into other solutions. There's always this convergence in technology. Some startup genius comes up with a cool new idea and builds a product around it, and eventually they get acquired, and the big company that bought them wants to integrate it, and that's soon the way everyone wants to go because of the kind of advantages I talked about earlier about more integrated, consolidated solutions, both for people that have to manage the technology and the ones that it's delivering the value to. You know, it's cheaper, it's less onerous in terms of impact on CPU cycles and storage and memory and those kind of things. More cost effective to manage. It's always nicer to have fewer vendors to deal with. So DLP is an example of that. I think it's getting absorbed into the other more integrated suites of capabilities, and Macronis is just one example of a company that's done that. We just acquired a DLP company last year, and we're about to we've finished the integration work, and we're about to launch that. I think enhanced email security is increasingly important these days. Something like 94% of all malware is delivered via phishing emails still. That's incredible that such a simple tactic still works, but you know, if you're like me and you're processing hundreds of messages from 5 different messaging platforms every day, you know, at the end of the day, you might let your cybersecurity antennae down a little bit and accidentally click on a link or open an attachment that you shouldn't. So anti-phishing, anti-email capabilities, I think, are going to be important going forward. That's another kind of capability that we're adding to our suite. I think we actually just announced that this week, if I'm not mistaken, that we've launched that. I talked about URL filtering. Probably the big one that I would worry about, and it's not so specific to Microsoft 365, is kind of broadly applicable, and in fact in SaaS environments you don't always have to worry about it, but vulnerability scanning and patch management. And this is the idea of surveilling your own applications to figure out which ones have outstanding patches, either for security or feature upgrades that you need to install. Typical small business leaves applications unpatched for over 3 months before they get around to it. And it's just because it's a treadmill. You know, everybody's issuing security updates or feature updates on a weekly basis. It's really hard to keep up. And if you have custom applications, say, running on a particular operating system, you might want to test like an OS upgrade before you install it to make sure that it doesn't break or crimp the functionality of one of your custom apps. So businesses have a lot of good excuses for not keeping up with scanning and patching. So tools that help you automate that process and kind of be programmatic about it can really help. You want it wherever you can. You want to close that window or shorten that window between the time a vendor makes a patch available and the time you get around to installing it. I'm trying to think if, obviously in a world where ransomware is the biggest threat and 90% or more of ransomware attacks are 0 days, meaning their fingerprints aren't known out there in the cybersecurity community, so they will not get caught by classic signature-based antivirus. You need smarter anti-malware solutions that use, the term we use is machine intelligence. It's not quite AI. It's not just simply ML. To identify malware by its behavior, what it's doing, not what it looks like. And if you are looking for suspicious behaviors, it doesn't make any difference if you've seen this particular iteration of the malware before. You don't need it to check your fingerprint file on it and hope that you've got that somebody's run across it before to provide that fingerprint. You just need to identify bad or suspicious behavior And if you do that, you're going to be in a much better position to detect and terminate these zero-day threats that, again, the ransomware folks are iterating multiple releases of their malware a day, and in many cases making custom versions of it for particular targets. So plain old SIG-based AV is not obsolete at this point. It'll still catch a lot of long-tail threats that are out there, but you really need to get more behavioral-centered anti-malware solutions if you're going to stop zero-day threats. So I think that there's a bunch there to think about as additional tools. And, you know, if you're a business and say like, oh, I can't manage all that, look for a service provider partner that can do that on your behalf. They'll be able to do it much more cost effectively. They'll be able to hire better cybersecurity professionals, because if you're a cybersecurity tech, it's more fun to work for an MSP than it is for a small business. You get more varied and exciting projects. You get to learn more skills. So in many ways, outsourcing to a technology partner like that is going to be, they're going to do it better than you can, and it's going to be cheaper for you to do it using them instead of trying to do it yourself. So look for providers that offer that range of capabilities.
Perfect, and we have a few more. How can I reduce our M365 risk besides adding cybersecurity technology?
Okay, reducing risk that doesn't involve cybersecurity technology. All right, well, one obvious way to approach this is process, right? The kind of the three legs of the cybersecurity triangle are people, process, and technology. So there are processes that you can put in place that basically say to people, look, like security awareness training is a really great tool that everyone needs to be looking at. So again, think phishing is nearly more than 90% of threats get delivered via phishing emails. So if you can get your employees to be a little bit more sensitive about their email handling, that can yield big dividends, right? So security awareness training that includes anti-phishing training or phishing awareness training is a good one. So the classic way to do this is security team sends out fake phishing emails to employees, and if they click on it, that means they fell for it. If it were real, it would have been a serious problem. And when that happens, you say, we caught you. Please try to be more careful in the future about handling emails where you're not absolutely sure that the originator is a trusted source. And maybe here's a little 5-minute refresher course that will have you go through, a little YouTube video to watch to kind of remind you of the ways in which the bad guys try to fool you. You know, I think about someone was clearly targeting me because they sent me a phishing email that looked like it was from my college alumni association, and I damn near bit on it. So they're getting more devious. You know, they're using artificial intelligence these days to iterate things. They're like campaign marketing managers that are trying different flavors of emails, measuring their results. So which header gets more clicks? You know, which graphics in the body of the email lead to more clicks? So again, this is the borrowing pages from the legitimate business world for nefarious ends. So phishing is going to continue to be a problem. Probably should broaden the definition of it's not just email, but email is still the vastly used one. I imagine other collab applications, you think about Slack and things like that, are increasingly going to be targets. I know that there's SMS phishing that's done. So I would say security awareness training is one of the things that's going to yield the highest payoff for you. The other non-sort of tech, more a process kind of issue that I think will help you defend your Microsoft 365 environments is incident response training. So in the event that you do suffer a ransomware attack or a breach, what you should do next in order to say contain the attack, prevent it from spreading across the network to afflict other applications and servers on your network, is not the first time that you have to do it. So think of fire drills. Fire alarm goes off. We know it's a drill. We find our way out of the building. We collect in the parking lot and do a head count. And so we know we don't have to think about it in the moment when a real fire happens. This is a good analogy, I think, for security instances, breaches or ransomware attacks. Create a plan where you know who has key responsibilities for each particular role. This guy has to shut down the network. This gal is responsible for ensuring that backup servers are offline. This person is in charge of crisis communications, both to employees, partners, customers, investors, if you're a public company. And you practice it at least once a year, ideally more often than that, so that when an incident does happen, you're not pulling your plan off the shelf for the first time trying to figure out, oh, this person is the key responsibility for it. They left the company a month ago. Oh, who do we call? We need to call this vendor for help. What's their number? Who's our contact there? Get all that stuff documented in an incident response plan and drill on it. And I think those are, it's not specific to Microsoft 365 as a general good practice, regardless of your application environment. But having that kind of process preparedness is something you can do that's not just throwing another cybersecurity tool at a particular problem.
We have another. What can my IT staff do to optimize our M365 environment aside from backup and cybersecurity?
All right, this is going a little outside of my expertise because it's, I'm a cybersecurity geek and I learned backup when I came to Acronis, but really the reason they hired me is living in the cybersecurity world forever. So the question is, outside of backup and cybersecurity, I'm going to be vamping a little bit, let's say here. One service that I keep seeing stories about, whether it's technology vendors or consultants, service providers who are offering this as a service, which is ways of optimizing your SaaS environment, and specifically Microsoft 365, because it's such a popular application, is often one of the ones they lead with. It's like, well, your Salesforce environment and your Microsoft 365 environment and your, I don't know, your marketing automation environment. I think of popular SaaS applications. And what they do is make sure to kind of go through all the different accounts that you have and make sure that you're not paying for stuff that you don't need. A lot of times companies will find themselves paying more than they have to because they started off in a lower usage band. It's like the 1 to 10 user band, and they kept paying on that basis when in fact they exceeded the 10 user band, and they should be up in the next contractual band and bring down their cost per seat in a significant way. So this is something I would look at, is sort of SaaS contract optimization services. I don't think there's a category name for it in the market yet, but it's definitely a coming thing. I wouldn't mind seeing Acronis get into that business, because I think it's just that much more value that our service provider partners can say, hey, look at all the cool things we can do for you. And a customer signs up for it, it makes it harder for them to leave and go to a competing provider. Increased stickiness is always something our MSP partners are looking for, and I think we could do that. So that would be something I would look at if you're looking for ways to optimize outside of the pure data protection and security environment.
And we have one more. We get a lot of annoying email advertising products. To make them go away, we can block the site from sending more junk. This does not always work. Another way these companies allow you to stop them from bothering you is they send a link that will supposedly delete them from their advertising list. Is this link worse than visiting their site for other reasons?
Wow, you've hit very close to home for me. Part of my responsibilities early on in my tenure at Acronis were campaign marketing related. And once that was associated with my job description, I had every vendor in the world with an email list banging on my email inbox to try to sell me a list of names. It's like, here's a list of all the names of your competitors. Here's a list of all Microsoft 365 customers in the world that we know of. If you want to market to these people, buy our list. And a lot of those people didn't have unsubscribe lists. So those, I think, are unsubscribe buttons, is what I meant to say there. No link to click on to unsubscribe. I would not hesitate to block those people, or at a minimum, set up a filter in my own Outlook inbox to shovel them directly into my junk folder. There are other sites or other email senders that I have to say look more legitimate. They look more professional. They've got unsubscribe links and privacy statement links and that sort of thing. There's no guarantee that because it looks legitimate that clicking on that link isn't going to invite the evils of the world in. But in general, I click on those links without too much fear, and they actually almost always honor my request to be taken off their list, at least within a couple of days. But, you know, remember all the other things I've said about phishing and how crafty cybercriminals are. You know, you think the typical ransomware as a service setup, so you got a small collection of very talented software developers who understand applications and networks and cybersecurity countermeasures, and they're writing code that can evade all of that. They got to get the malware on there in the first place, so they enlist this army of distributors around the world. You don't have to be tech savvy to become one of these. You just need a browser and a network connection, no scruples, and hopefully a location beyond the extradition reach of the country you're targeting to get that on there. So these people are sitting there all day trying different ways to get past your literal spam filter or the virtual one in your head. So there's no guarantees there. I think one of the ways that you can address this is, again, with there's a tool for that, and it's anti-phishing capabilities and URL filtering capabilities. And so what these rely on a kind of a broader intelligence network to identify known malicious or spammy sources and either keep it from hitting your inbox, or if you do click on it, to catching it before that request leaves the organization. And between those two things, that's going to make it safer. I know I've got those backstopping me because Acronis has at least the URL filtering capability. I don't think we have anti-phishing yet, though that's it wouldn't surprise me if that's on our service roadmap. But I think if you don't have those capabilities in place, you do need to be careful. The safer thing might be to do is just trash it. Never respond to it. That's one of my rules of thumb. Never, you know, I get these pleading emails like, oh, this is my third email to you. Can you please respond and tell me to go away if you don't want me to? It's like, no, I didn't ask for you to contact me. If I took the time to respond to every email like that, I'd waste a couple of hours a week. So just ignore it, trash it, filter it to send it away. And if you don't have backstops like anti-phishing and URL filtering, don't click on it. Just don't click on that unsubscribe link. Just delete them.
All right, thank you so much, James. It looks like we're a little bit short on time. Are there any other slides you'd like to show, or?
Oh yeah. Let me real quick show a couple things here. I promised some resources here. There's my my. Oh no, I didn't put a link to my ebook on supply chain attacks. But if you type in supply chain attacks on the Acronis Resource Center site. It'll come right up. It's a fairly recent one. But I do have a bunch of cool stuff specifically around Microsoft 365. There's a new ebook we published. It really talks about techniques for defending your Microsoft 365 environment, and it doesn't touch on it. Spends far less time on Acronis solutions than I did today. It really is just about a broad set of principles that you can implement, like the kind of zero trust philosophy. That's brand new. We had an outside guy do it. It's a terrific piece. A couple of case studies. We're partnered with all kinds of cool sports teams because most of them are super data driven these days. They're using analytics. The racing car people, their cars are basically supercomputers with 1,000 sensors. They're collecting all kinds of data. The typical baseball or basketball or football team is collecting all kinds of video information to help players optimize their swing or their shot or their pitch. And so that means gobs of data that has to be protected, backed up, and secured. So our partners are really cool. Our sports partners are really cool examples of what our technology can do, because they're kind of out on the edge in terms of the amounts of data that they're handling. And so Arsenal Football Club, sort of Premier League soccer team in the UK, and Hendricks Motorsports, they're NASCAR based in the US. Some cool case studies there. And then there's one other resource. That's a white paper I wrote a little while ago, but is still kind of fresh and up to date in helping you identify the gaps between what you're probably accustomed to in Microsoft Backup versus what you get in Microsoft 365. You might be comfortable with it, but I find that a lot of users are surprised to learn at how little protection they're getting from Microsoft there. So that's worth at least taking a look at, so you know what's coming if you need to restore from backup and are relying only on Microsoft. I always mention our foundation. This is our nonprofit arm that builds schools and provides tech training to kids all over the world. If you got the means and the inclination, give us a donation. That's it from me. Thanks again, Jolene. Thanks everybody for taking the time today.
Perfect. Give me 1 second as I take back screen control and close out the webinar. All right, thank you so much, James, for your informative presentation, for taking the time to be here today. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day.